Imagine you're standing in the middle of a swamp after a thunderstorm. The ground is soaked, the air is heavy, everything around you says water. Then lightning hits. On August 4th, 2011, the Great Dismal Swamp caught fire. Not for a day, not for a week, for 111 days. Even Hurricane Irene couldn't finish it off. Because the real fuel wasn't above the swamp, it was under it. Ancient peat. To understand how that can happen, you have to rewind far past the fire. The Great Dismal Swamp sits on the border of Virginia and North Carolina, and it's old. Roughly 9,000 years old. Older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than most cities humans have ever built. For thousands of years, plants fell into water here and didn't fully rot. They piled up layer after layer, turning into peat, dark, wet, acidic soil. The kind of soil that can hold stories, artifacts, and carbon for longer than entire civilizations last. At one point, this swamp may have covered more than 1 million acres. That's an area bigger than the state of Rhode Island, just sitting there on the coastal plain like a huge wet sponge.
And people lived with it. Indigenous communities knew this landscape long before it appeared on colonial maps. Later, people escaping slavery found refuge inside it too, building hidden lives in a place outsiders called useless. But Europeans looked at the swamp and saw something else. Not a living system, not a carbon vault, a problem. In the 1760s, investors began cutting ditches through the swamp. One of the men tied to that early effort was George Washington. The goal was simple: drain the water, harvest the timber, and turn useless wetland into useful land. Over time, about 150 miles of ditches sliced through the swamp, mile after mile, like cuts in a sponge. And every ditch did the same quiet thing. It let the water leave. That sounds small. It wasn't. Here's the thing about peat. It only works when it's wet. Peat is basically unfinished decay. Leaves, roots, branches, dead plants, all of it falls into standing water. But because there's so little oxygen down there, the material doesn't break down the way it would in a dry forest. It just builds up. Slowly. Patiently. Century after century.
That's why peatlands are so important. They cover only about 3 to 4% of the world's land, but they store an enormous share of the carbon locked in soil. Think of them like natural carbon batteries. They charge very slowly over thousands of years, and they hold that charge as long as the water stays in place. In a wet swamp, the water is the lock. It keeps oxygen away. It slows the microbes that would normally chew through dead plants. It turns a messy pile of leaves and roots into a long-term storage system. But pull the water out, and the battery starts leaking. The peat gets oxygen. It dries. It shrinks. The ancient plant matter starts breaking down, and carbon that was buried for centuries begins moving back into the air. And if it gets dry enough, it can burn. Not like a normal forest fire with flames racing through branches. A peat fire is slower, dirtier, meaner. It smolders underground, sometimes with almost no visible flame at all. You can walk over ground that looks dead and gray and still have fire moving beneath your boots.
You'd think rain would solve that. But with peat, water has to reach the fire underground. And when the soil has dried, cracked, and changed, even a huge storm may not be enough. Scientists know the basic rule. Wet peat stores carbon. Dry peat loses it. But the exact balance gets messy. Carbon dioxide, methane, water level, soil damage, forest type, all of it matters. That's what made 2011 so dangerous. The swamp wasn't just burning. The swamp had become the fuel. By the time lightning hit in 2011, the Great Dismal Swamp had already been weakened for generations. The ditches had lowered the water, logging had changed the forest, roads had cut the landscape into pieces. And when peat dries, it doesn't politely wait to become a problem. It starts changing. It becomes lighter, more fragile, more exposed to oxygen. In some places, the top layer degrades so badly that it doesn't hold water the way it used to. Imagine taking a wet kitchen sponge, drying it in the sun, and then expecting it to soak up water like nothing happened. It won't. Not at first.
Now, make that sponge a swamp, and then set it on fire. In 2008, the South One fire burned through part of the refuge for 121 days. It covered about 2,400 hectares, roughly the size of more than 4,400 football fields. That fire didn't just burn plants. It damaged peat, killed trees, and left behind a landscape full of dead fuel. So when 2011 came, the swamp wasn't starting from zero. It was starting from a wound. On August 4, lightning ignited what became the Lateral West fire. Within days, smoke was rising over the refuge. NASA satellites could see it from space. On the ground, firefighters were dealing with something much harder than burning trees. They were dealing with burning earth. A surface fire can be surrounded. A tree can be cut down. Flames can be knocked back. But peat doesn't play by those rules. It can smolder below the surface, creep through the soil, and pop back up after people think it's gone. Then, Hurricane Irene arrived. You'd think that would be the end. A hurricane dumping rain on a swamp fire? Done. Finished. Nope.
The storm dropped heavy rain across the area, but the fire kept going. Because the heat wasn't just sitting on top of the ground, it was buried in the peat, protected inside the very soil the swamp had spent thousands of years building. And the cost was huge. Researchers later estimated that the 2011 fire burned away an average of about 47 centimeters of peat in the studied area, nearly the height of a small child from foot to knee. They also estimated a loss of about 1.10 teragrams of carbon. That's more than 1 million metric tons of carbon, enough mass to outweigh several 100,000 pickup trucks. And remember, that's carbon the swamp had spent thousands of years storing. The 2008 and 2011 fires together released roughly 6.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, about the same scale as the yearly emissions from around 1 million cars. Wait, a swamp, releasing carbon like a city full of traffic. And here's the part that makes this feel less like a disaster and more like a time machine breaking open. Scientists estimated that replacing the lost soil carbon could take about 1,740 years. That's longer than the time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and today.
So the fire didn't just burn a forest, it burned time. It burned stored sunlight, ancient plants, centuries of slow accumulation. And if that sounds dramatic, it should. Because peat doesn't grow back like grass after rain. It builds in thin layers, season after season, only when the water, plants, and chemistry all line up. And that's why a single deep peat fire can erase more climate history than a human lifetime can restore. And that raises a darker question. What if the Great Dismal Swamp wasn't just the victim of one unlucky lightning strike? What if the real disaster had started when people first taught the swamp to drain? What if the swamp had been turned, slowly, into a carbon source? For a long time, people thought the swamp was the thing that needed fixing. Too wet, too wild, too hard to farm, too hard to control. But the twist is this: the swamp wasn't the problem, the drainage was. When the Great Dismal Swamp was wet, it was doing something incredibly valuable, even if no one in the 1700s had the language for it. It was storing carbon, locking it underground, holding it in peat, roots, fallen wood, and soaked soil.
But once people cut the ditches, lowered the water, and opened that peat to air, the whole system started to change. Scientists modeling the swamp's carbon balance from 1985 to 2015 found something disturbing. Without major fires, the swamp could have acted as a carbon sink, taking in more carbon than it released. But with 6 fires included, the balance flipped. A sink became a source. That's the real reveal here. This wasn't just a swamp that caught fire. It was a climate machine running backward. And the damage goes even deeper. A 2024 study estimated that since colonial times, the Great Dismal Swamp may have lost about 50 million metric tons of carbon. That's a number so large it's hard to feel. So picture this. 50 million metric tons is roughly the weight of more than 300,000 blue whales. Gone from the system. Not all in one fire, not all at once, but through centuries of drainage, logging, soil loss, and burning. Now there is a way to slow it down. You do the opposite of what people did for 250 years. You put the water back.
Across the refuge, managers have installed water control structures in the old ditches. Simple-looking barriers, gates, and boards that slow drainage and raise the water level. So far, about 75 of these structures have been installed across a ditch network that runs for about 150 miles. Again, picture that, a line of drainage channels long enough to stretch from New York City to Philadelphia, carved through a swamp that was never supposed to drain that way. And the restoration is working. Rewetted areas are holding more water, the peat is becoming less likely to burn, and estimates suggest these restored peat wetlands can store about 200,000 metric tons of carbon per year, about the annual emissions of around 42,000 cars. But hold on, this isn't a magic reset button. Once peat dries and breaks down, it doesn't always behave like healthy peat again. Some damaged peat doesn't soak up water easily. Some areas still depend on roads that firefighters need during emergencies. And when wetlands are re-wetted, scientists still have to watch methane because wet soils can release it under the right conditions. So the honest answer is complicated. Rewetting helps a lot.
But the swamp can't simply go back to 1760. It has to become something new, a damaged system slowly being taught how to hold water again. And that's why the Great Dismal Swamp matters. It's not just a patch of dark water and trees on a map. It's a warning. For indigenous people, it was home. For maroon communities escaping slavery, it was shelter. For wildlife, it's still a refuge. And for the planet, it's something else entirely. A memory bank made of water, plants, and time. But when we drained it, we didn't just change the landscape. We opened the vault. Today, the refuge protects about 113,000 acres, a fragment of what this swamp used to be, but still large enough to matter, large enough to burn, large enough to heal, large enough to remind us that some of Earth's most powerful systems don't look powerful at all. They look quiet, muddy, still, until the water leaves. And somewhere under that stillness, ancient carbon is waiting. Not in a factory, not in a smokestack, in the ground beneath a swamp that once knew exactly how to keep it buried.